Okay, so we've got this new study we're diving into, and the headline is Something Else. It claims to have found that autism runs in families.
Uh-huh.
Now,
Yeah.
for anyone who knows, like, anything about autism,
Right.
especially those within the community, this is probably not exactly news to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it's not just like, your friend saying, "Oh yeah, my kid was diagnosed and my uncle also, might be on the spectrum." Like this is a big study from UC Davis Mind Institute, which is,
Yeah,
a big deal in autism research.
absolutely.
Um, and they followed over 1,600 infants
Wow.
across something like 18 different sites
Wow.
for
Yeah.
3 years. So this was a commitment.
3 years, that's a serious
Yeah.
research endeavor.
Yeah.
So, okay, what exactly did they find? Like, what's all the hubbub about?
So it seems like what they were really focused on, the core of the study, was trying to identify like genetic markers
Okay.
and then determining what they called recurrence rates. Recurrence rates, okay.
Of autism within families. So,
So how often it pops up, basically.
yeah, like if you have one child
Yes.
who's autistic, what's the chance that another sibling might be?
Okay, so trying to quantify it, essentially.
Yeah.
But as we kind of alluded to, like that idea in and of itself isn't really new. And that's where we're bringing in this critique from Janie Horrocks.
Yes.
Who is an autistic writer, researcher, has their PhD. So they're coming at this from, a very informed perspective.
Absolutely.
And they argue that this kind of research, even with the best of intentions,
Yeah.
is rooted in what's called this deficit model of autism. So can you unpack that for us a little bit? Like, what does that even mean, the deficit model?
So the deficit model basically frames autism as like a problem to be solved.
Okay.
It's a deviation from what's considered typical development. So the idea is that it needs to be prevented or
No.
corrected in some way.
No.
And obviously,
Horrocks, and I think a lot of folks in the autism community are pushing back against that whole framing
yeah.
and saying like, hey, what if we look at this
Right.
through a totally different lens?
And that lens is where that PTMF comes in, right?
Yes, exactly. The power threat meaning framework.
So break down that acronym for us. What is that?
Okay, so it sounds kind of maybe jargony at first.
Yeah.
But essentially, it's a framework. It was developed by a bunch of psychologists and researchers.
All right.
And they were really trying to find a way to understand distress and behavior,
Okay.
not as like inherent flaws within a person.
Right. Not like something's wrong with you.
Right, exactly. But instead, like understandable responses
Okay.
to different forms of like power, threat,
Oh,
social injustice.
But like your environment is actually impacting
Exactly.
how you're behaving, how you're existing.
Yeah, like how much of this is actually coming from within
Right.
versus like the environment that we're all existing in.
So instead of just looking at, an autistic child and seeing all the ways that maybe they're quote unquote behind or they're struggling,
Right.
the PTMF is saying, well, hold on, let's look at what else is going on.
Exactly. And what are the systems around this person?
Okay, so that's the PTMF. But how does that apply to this study, right? Because we're talking about this genetic study.
Yeah.
Where does that all connect?
Well, and that's, I think, where the critique gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because Horrocks is arguing that this whole focus on genetics, while it might give us some interesting information,
Okay.
it can also really distract from the very real issues
Yeah.
that autistic people are dealing with, like right now in their lives.
Day to day.
Exactly. And, one of the things that really struck me from this critique was this statistic that they brought up about the unemployment rate
Yes.
among autistic adults.
Which is staggering, by the way.
It's wild, right? It's like almost 90%.
Yeah. I mean, when I saw that number, I was like, whoa.
It's huge. And I think, they use that number to really highlight this point
Yeah.
about research priorities, right? Like we're spending all this money, time, energy on these genetic studies, which again, not saying they're useless, but
Right.
are we actually
What's
addressing
going on right now?
exactly like people need jobs, they need support.
Yeah, that's a pretty basic need.
Yeah.
And it's like we're ignoring this huge thing. And that's where it gets kind of interesting because the source we're looking at, they use this really like out there analogy to kind of
Right.
drive this point home.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So they compare it to like if you can imagine Stefan
Okay.
from Saturday Night Live
Oh wow.
doing like a bit about this study.
I'm here for it. Okay.
So picture this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Stefan on Weekend Update, he's got that like manic grin.
Yes.
And he's like, this study's got it all. Autism recurrence rates, creepy data surveillance of siblings,
Well,
genetic crystal balls.
it's like, this study has like everything.
Right.
Like it's got like glowing projections of like
Right, like those kids from The Shining.
yes, like just rows and rows of like twin toddlers, but they can like predict your future or something.
Yeah, and it's like, meanwhile, you've got researchers in lab coats hunched over microscopes, and they're like analyzing sibling data
Yes.
like it's like the Holy Grail.
Yes. And they're like whispering about like early intervention is key.
Right.
You got to get in there before
Before it's too late.
yes, before it's too late. And that's, I think, where, the satire really kind of hits.
Yeah.
Because it is that whole framing of autism as something to be like feared to be caught
Right.
early, like it's some kind of,
Like a disease.
yeah. And Horrocks is really, I think, pushing back against that because that language has real consequences.
Oh, absolutely. Because especially if you're a parent and you're getting this message, it's terrifying, right? Because it's like, oh my gosh,
It's like this genetic lottery
Yes.
that you've either, won or lost.
Right. And it's like, there's something wrong with my kid.
Right. And it creates this idea that there's only one right way for a brain to be.
Right.
And anything outside of that is a problem.
Is broken. Got to fix it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this study. We've got this critique of the study using the PTMF. How do those two things actually connect, though?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
And Horrocks is basically saying, look, if we look at this through that PTMF lens,
Okay.
we can start to see how this really intense focus on genetics,
Yeah.
it might be interesting, but it distracts us from the bigger picture.
Systems, yeah.
Like, what about those social structures, those power imbalances, right?
What's making it harder?
Yes, exactly. Like, what if those things have more of an impact than any gene ever could?
And isn't that what's so brilliant about that Stefan bit?
Yeah.
Is it's like, it's funny, but it's also like, wait a minute.
It makes you think.
Yeah, it's like, why are we so obsessed with trying to predict this
Yes.
when there are these other huge things?
Well, let's address the now,
Yeah.
the here and now.
It's like, forget the crystal ball. We need to address, like, the support.
Yes.
The discrimination.
The very real struggles
Yes.
that people are facing.
And it's almost like by focusing on the genetics so much, we're trying to solve a problem that, like, maybe doesn't need to be solved.
Right.
Maybe instead of trying to fix everyone, we should just accept that, like, brains are different.
Yes, and
Okay.
that's not a bad thing. And in fact, I mean, that's something that Horrocks talks about is like
Yeah.
neurodiversity
Yeah.
is like a good thing.
Right.
It's not something to be afraid of.
Like, imagine if everyone was the same. How boring would that be?
Right. And I mean, think about, throughout history,
Yeah.
all these like amazing minds,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like people who thought differently,
Yeah.
who like pushed the boundaries.
Yeah.
A lot of times those are people who, if they were around today, they might be diagnosed with.
Right, they'd be labeled.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, and so it's like, what if instead of trying to like fit everyone into this little box,
Wait, yeah, what if we just, like,
embraced it all?
the spectrum?
Yeah. So how do we even begin to do that?
Right. Because that's the real question, right? Like, it's one thing to say, oh, yeah, neurodiversity, we should add. Yeah, and that's like the challenge, right? Like, how do we actually make that shift?
Yeah.
And I think Horrocks has some really insightful things to say about that, like they're really advocating for this, like,
Yeah.
big picture paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Moving away from autism as this collection of, like,
Right.
deficits.
Right. Like things to be fixed.
Yeah. And instead being like,
Right.
what about the strengths?
What's good? What's possible? Exactly. And things like heightened sensory perception.
Yeah.
Right. Or like an incredible ability to focus on detail.
Absolutely.
Pattern recognition.
Yeah.
Like all of these things that.
A different way of thinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which, we often kind of.
Pathologize.
Yes, exactly.
Like, oh, they're so obsessed with this one thing.
Right. But what if that's actually like
Yeah.
an amazing skill?
Yeah. What if they're really good at that thing that they're obsessed with because of how their brain works?
And that I think goes back to this idea that
Yeah.
neurodiversity, like it's not new. This isn't something that just popped up.
Right.
Horrocks actually argues that like a lot of these traits that we now call autism
Yeah.
were probably really important for
Yeah.
our ancestors.
Interesting.
Like imagine, you're back in the hunter-gatherer days, right?
Okay.
Being able to recognize patterns.
Right. That would be good for survival.
Yes. Like tracking, finding your way
Yeah.
back, like identifying plants or even like coming up with new tools,
Right.
right?
Totally.
So
Yeah.
it's like, what if instead of viewing it as this modern day, like, oh no problem, what if it was actually
Right.
part of what,
Essential.
yes,
Yeah.
essential for us getting
Listen,
here?
it makes you think, right? Like, what if instead of spending millions on like gene editing and all this stuff,
Uh,
we spent that money on just like
Supporting people.
creating a world that works for everyone.
Yes.
Imagine that.
Wouldn't that be something?
Right? Like instead of trying to be like, oh, we got to get rid of all the
Right.
quote unquote weird people.
The square pegs in the round holes. Yeah.
It's like, what if the pegs are fine and we just need
Let's change the shape of the hole.
Here we go. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's a good place to kind of like leave it for our listeners
Yeah.
is to really sit with this idea that, this isn't about like we're not saying one side is right or wrong or this research is bad. It's just
Right.
it's about looking at it from all these different angles and being open to these like bigger questions and how we can actually support people
Absolutely.
in the here and now
Yeah.
and create a world that really does celebrate neurodiversity.
All the brains.
All the brains, that's right.
Celebrate the spectrum.
So thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
This has been really interesting.
This was great.
And until next time.